do we have here? This is that switch. It goes in the back plate of a Glock. It's got a little push button on the side there. That allows the gun to be operated in a fully automatic fashion, meaning as long as you keep the trigger pressed to the rear, the gun will continue to fire until it runs out of ammunition or presumably malfunctions. And there we have the drum magazine. I don't know how many rounds that holds, maybe 50 rounds, could be more, a lot of rounds. Can you just shoot through the door? This is from a camera. So there may be nobody in the home. This may be footage that was retrieved, when the homeowner came back and found his car gone. So there may be no threat to persons at all. Well, there may be no person to be threatened, in which case there'd be no person to act in self-defense, in which case we would have nothing to talk about. So for our purposes, let's presume that this camera is mounted on the door. There's somebody on the inside of the camera who's observing this and could do something. What would they be legally privileged to do? By the way, a lot of times these bad guys, this is their job. As far as they're concerned, this is their job. This is what they do for a living. This is how they feed their families. So when you interfere with them, attempt to stop them, they feel completely justified in preventing your interference. You have a job to do. Your job is to comply with their demands. What would be the various bases that would allow for the use of force here? Well, let's start with the use of deadly force, which is what most people are primarily interested in. The use of deadly defensive force. Well, there's a number, right? One would be defense of yourself. Another would be defense of others. So combined, those are defense of persons. And then there's defense of property. Now, in 49 states, you cannot use deadly force in defense of property in the absence of a threat to persons. And if there is a threat to persons, then it's a defense of persons scenario. It's not a defense of property scenario anymore. So in defense of property, in the absence of a threat to persons, non-deadly force only. The only exception would be Texas. Texas does have a provision for the use of deadly force in defense of property, which would almost certainly apply here. So Texas Penal Code 9.42, deadly force to protect property. And they don't mean dwelling here. There's many states that have special privileges for the use of deadly force in defense of your dwelling, your habitation, your castle. What we're talking about here is just an unoccupied car. That's merely personal property. So a person is justified in using deadly force against another to protect land or tangible movable property, which is what the unoccupied car would be here, if he would be justified in using force against the other under section 9.41, which is the simple non-deadly force in defense of property. So first you have to meet those conditions of that statute. Today we'll just presume that would be the case here. And so additional conditions to use deadly force in defense of personal property when and to the degree the defender reasonably believes the deadly force is immediately necessary to prevent the other's imminent commission of arson, burglary, robbery, aggravated robbery, theft, during the nighttime, or criminal mischief during the nighttime. So we would meet that qualification. The defender would need to reasonably believe that the property cannot be protected or recovered by any other means than deadly force. Anybody believe that something other than deadly force could protect this property when a gun's being displayed in this manner? And by the way, the person standing next to the car also has a gun. He's pointing it there. So multiple guns, disparity of numbers. The property cannot be protected by other means, or the use of force other than deadly force to protect or recover the property would expose the defender to a substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury. You're not going out there with pepper spray, right? Up against two guns and multiple aggressors. So if you were in Texas, you'd be privileged to use deadly force in self-defense here, in defense of property. But every other state, every other American jurisdiction, you could not use deadly force in defense of property, absent a threat of persons. But arguably, there is a threat to persons. You can see that at least a bad actor right at the door, and the guy behind him in the background. They're both pointing guns directly at the door. Again, if we presume the door is open, so we're not yet addressing the shoot through the door question, and the defender standing in the doorway, is he facing an imminent threat of deadly force? That's the question for defense of person. It's always the same framework. It's always the same 5 elements: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. So innocence, who's the unlawful aggressor? Well, pretty obviously the car thieves wielding the guns, right? Imminence is the threat either actually occurring or immediately about to occur. Well, the threat here is death or serious bodily injury. Clearly it's imminent. They're pointing guns. Shots aren't yet being fired, but the threat can happen like that. It's not a past threat that's over. It's not a future speculative threat that may never happen. So imminence also checked off. Proportionality. What degree of threat is there? Well, clearly it's deadly force, reasonably perceived as deadly force. Even if we were to discover that all these guns were fake, they look real, and so they can be appropriately treated as if they were real guns. It's a deadly force threat. That checks off proportionality. The question of avoidance, there's only 11 states that are duty to retreat states that impose a legal duty to retreat if safely possible possible before you can use force in self-defense. If we're presuming the door is open here, you're not outrunning a bullet fired from one of those guns. There is no practical safe retreat possible. So avoidance would be off the table, satisfied for the defender, and reasonableness. Would a defender in this circumstance have a subjective, genuine, good faith belief they're facing a deadly force threat, an imminent, unlawful deadly force threat? Yes. Would a reasonable and prudent person in those circumstances share that belief that they were facing an imminent, unlawful, deadly force threat? Sure. So if the defender is just standing in the doorway and guns are being pointed at him in this fashion, clearly he would have a legal privilege to use deadly force in self-defense. Now, what if the owner's not standing in an open doorway? What if he's behind the closed door and he sees this? What would be his justification for using deadly force, deadly defensive force here? Simply shooting through the door. Would the elements of self-defense be satisfied here? Is it necessary that he open the door before the conditions for the lawful use of deadly defensive force are satisfied? There's nothing in any self-defense statute in any state that says you have to open the door. There's nothing in any self-defense statute in any state that says you can't shoot through the door. So whether or not can you legally shoot through your door is not really the question. The real question is, can you use deadly defensive force while meeting the required elements of a lawful use of deadly defensive force? If you can, it doesn't really matter if you're shooting through a door or hanging upside down. The whole shooting through the door narrative becomes confusing for some people because they're making a presumption. They're presuming that if you're shooting through a door, you don't really know what's happening on the other side. And therefore, you might be shooting at, who knows, a neighbor knocking on the door, a cop who's got at the wrong address for a domestic violence call and he's pounding on the door, right? The Theodore Wafer shooting in Detroit some years ago where he ended up shooting a very drunk young black woman outside his front door because he believed there was a home invasion occurring. He lived in a neighborhood where that was not uncommon. He had a shotgun in his hand, ready to defend his home. Turned out it was not a home invasion happening, in fact, and he ended up getting convicted and sentenced essentially to the rest of his life in prison. It's easy to get in trouble shooting through a door. It's important that you know what's actually happening on the other side of that door. It's important that you know where your shots are likely to end up, because it would be easy to shoot through a door recklessly. So it's important that you know enough about what's happening on the other side of the door, first, to know that those elements necessary to justify the use of deadly defensive force are satisfied. And second, that you know where your rounds are going to go, that you're not just firing blindly through the door. And if the conduct is reckless, it can't really be lawful self-defense because recklessness is not reasonableness. But having said all that, there are circumstances in which you could be on one side of a closed door and be able to identify that there are bad actors on the other side of that closed door that you have reason to believe you can accurately engage with fire. I mean, there he's pretty much in front of the door. You can tell where he is, right? If you're watching the camera feed. Now, I would note that this is a residential community. There's lots of homes around. So it would be easy to get tagged with a felony reckless endangerment charge if you act recklessly. You don't have a right to endanger those other people in a reckless manner. Pretend it's not a camera. Pretend it's one of those little vision things that we used to put indoors before we had things like Ring cameras. So your eyeball is up against the door and he points a gun at you in this way. Is that a threat to you, to your person? Sure. So I would argue that if you saw that and you just fired your own gun through the door with a reasonable expectation of neutralizing this threat, that would be a lawful use of force, deadly defensive force, firing through a door. You're not firing blind. You have information about what's happening on the other side of that door that allows you to make reasoned decisions in self-defense. What about the guy in the background? He's also pointing a gun. Well, then the question would be, well, are you still confident your rounds would hit that guy after they pass through a door? I mean, when a bullet goes through an obstacle, its path afterwards can be pretty unpredictable. I would not have a great degree of confidence that even if I aligned the gun properly, if I fired it through a door, that I'd hit that guy back there. Maybe you could make the argument, but it would be open to contestation. In which case, if you're firing at this kind of point, I would argue it's simply a straight up self-defense scenario. It's got nothing to do with the car, your decision to use deadly defensive force. You look out the little peephole and there's a gun pointed at you. So you drew your own gun and you used deadly defensive force to neutralize an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force against you. What if this wasn't a car theft? What if this was a straight up armed robbery at a street corner and he walked up and waved this gun in your face and said, "Give me your wallet"? Would that not be an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force? Would you not be privileged to use deadly defensive force to defend yourself against that armed robbery? I would say yes. That's a very sound argument for the legal use of deadly defensive force in self-defense. What about now? You come up to the door now, You peep through the little peephole. Oh, you're open your door. You're standing in the doorway. And the car's backing out here, just about to drive away. Can you use deadly defensive force now? Well, in Texas, you could to prevent the theft of the vehicle, but absent, that's a pure up defense of personal property, deadly force in defense of personal property under Texas law. But absent Texas, you need a threat to persons narrative. You need these 5 elements: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. Now, I can't see here. Are the bad guys? I don't know what that flickering is back there. I noticed at least the bad guy near the door also had a weapons-mounted light on the Glock. If that light is pointed at the homeowner, the Glock is pointed at the homeowner. What the homeowner would need to do here to justify firing shots at this car, really at the people in the car, would be able to articulate that he was still facing an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force against himself. So it's a defense of person scenario. Maybe he can do that. Maybe it's visible here. I can't see it, that they're still pointing a gun at him. If they're still pointing a gun at him, they're still an imminent deadly force threat. But the point is, he would be defending himself, not defending his car. And by the way, when he's questioned by police, which he should not be answering substantively to without counsel present, but if he were to give an explanation to police, his explanation should definitely not be, I didn't want them to steal my car, that's why I shot them. His explanation should be, I was facing an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm to my person, and I shot to protect me, not to protect my car. Now, there's a lot of sentiment. Let's see, I think I may even have the original tweet I saw with this, because I think we can all understand the kind of sentiment we might see here. On the original post, and I don't think I saw the original post, but there were countless not very bright people, I'm paraphrasing, stating that the owner would be in the wrong to come out or shoot it out to protect his property. Writes this person here. Black Rifle DRT. The absolute mental gymnastics to defend thieves is beyond me, but here we are. Granted, is it worth it to engage in a firefight, especially with loved ones in harm's way? Now, I didn't see any loved ones in harm's way here, but we can see, this is very common, what's being conflated here. Kind of what's morally right and what's legally right. This person writes, the absolute mental gymnastics to defend the thieves. I don't think anyone's defending the thieves. If someone says it wouldn't be legally justified to use deadly force in defense of the personal property of the car outside of Texas, that's not saying what the thieves are doing is good or defensible. It's just accurately observing what the law actually allows. And the law does not allow you to kill people over stuff. So saying you wouldn't be justified in shooting these thieves, depending on the circumstances, is not a defense of the thieves. But of course, we're all morally outraged. So we work hard for our stuff. There are laws against theft for good reason. We don't want our stuff stolen. There are laws that allow for the use of force in defense of your stuff, just generally not deadly force. You can make complicated arguments about how, well, I went out there just to remonstrate with them to please not steal my car, and then they pointed guns at me. So I wasn't really, the gun in my hand wasn't really brought to use in defense of my property. It was brought to use in defense of myself. But of course, a lot of these kinds of crimes are happening in urban centers in which the charging decisions are being made by people who favor thieves over lawful defenders. And those people have the power and authority to subject you to the equivalent of a medieval witch dunking trial. If a woman is claimed to be a witch, they would throw her in the river, and if she floats, she's a witch. And if she sinks, well, then at least we know she's not a witch. Of course, she drowns and dies, but I guess she wasn't a witch after all. The cost of these kinds of trials, especially if you kill someone, they can put you to this test. They'll charge you with murder. Now you're looking at a trial that can easily cost a couple of $100,000 in pre-trial expense before you even get the trial. That could take years to run. And if you're a 77-year-old, how many years do you have? You want to spend the last 5 years of your life as a defendant in a murder trial? Maybe in jail because you can't make whatever $1 million bail they impose for murder charges, because that happens. And even if you're acquitted, then what? So this takes 5 years. Then he's out when he's 82. What if he's not acquitted? What if they offer him a plea, serve 1 year, misdemeanor? That's a pretty good plea if you're facing a murder charge. But if you're 77 years old, how many years do you have left that you want to spend one of them sitting in a jail, eating bologna sandwiches? But that's the power of these prosecutors. Unfortunately, most people don't know who their prosecutors are. They either vote blindly or they don't vote for that position. These are elected positions at the state level. And these prosecutors have incredible authority and power. And if that authority and power is used imprudently, unwisely, in politically motivated ways, what we get is the chaos we have. have today, like the Daniel Penny case in New York City, the chokehold case there, like a lot of these high-profile cases we see, the Kyle Rittenhouse case, the George Zimmerman case, the Derek Chauvin case, George Floyd case. Lots of these that we cover are being driven by politically motivated prosecutors. And there's no real check on that power and authority, other than next time electing somebody else. In elections that typically revolve around a few hundred people voting, maybe a few thousand people voting. In elections where traditionally, maybe each side running for that office, both of whom would have been normally long-standing members of the legal community that everybody knows, maybe they each spent a few $1,000s to campaign. So when George Soros comes in and drops $500,000 in one of these prosecutor races, he just bought that slot. And often the person he puts in there is someone not a long-standing member of the legal community. Often it's somebody relatively freshly minted out of law school with little actual legal experience, but lots of political motivation, often running on political campaigns. And it's kind of like if you've ever lived in an HOA, you know, the people you want running your HOA are people who don't want that job. They're doing it because someone has to do it, and they don't want some lunatic to have the job of running the HOA, because we all know how that turns out. Because if the lunatic who wants the job gets the job of running the HOA, you just gave a little Napoleon a lot of power. And if they run rampant with it, there's really not much you can do to prevent them from making your life miserable. And that's just stuff like, you know, leaving your garbage cans out too long. Here we're talking about prospective murder charges, hundreds of thousands of dollars in expense, the rest of your life in a cage. Because the risk of conviction is never zero, folks.